Hey guys, tonight we begin somewhere cold, somewhere stone, somewhere where dinner wasn't a question of what's for dinner, but more like, is there dinner? You see, when most people picture medieval castles, they imagine fairy tales, grand feasts, noble knights, candlelit banquets with roasted boars and goblets overflowing with wine. But that's not quite how it worked during a siege. Because the moment enemy troops surrounded your lovely stone home with catapults and pointy sticks, the biggest threat wasn't swords or arrows, it was your stomach. Welcome to Whispered History, the place where medieval myths come to starve quietly, of course. So before you get too comfortable, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy what we do here. Oh, and tell us in the comments, what time is it where you are and what part of the world are you listening from? Now let's imagine you live in a medieval castle. It's early winter. There are 300 people inside. And outside 3,000 angry soldiers who'd rather wait you out than storm the gates. The bread is getting smaller. The air smells like, well, let's just call it farm fresh, with a hint of desperation. And your only comfort is the barrel of oats sitting in the corner and a cat that may or may not be your best soldier. Dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together where survival wasn't about strength. It was about stew. So, you're in a medieval castle. The fire's burning low. The sky outside is the kind of gray that seems to lean on the roof. You've already counted the cracks in the stone walls, paced the courtyard 3 times, and your neighbor just sneezed for the 10th time today. Which is still better than hearing the clang of armor and shouting from enemy troops right outside your gates. Because make no mistake, this is a siege. Not the dramatic kind with flaming arrows flying overhead every 5 minutes, but the slow stomach-growling, soul-squeezing kind. The one where time is the real weapon. And the thing is, medieval castles were built to survive these, not just with thick walls or towers or those charming murder holes above the gatehouse, but with something far less glamorous. Food storage. Yep. Before a castle thought about where to place its archers, it had to decide, where do we keep the oats? Let's start with the granaries. Now I know that word might not stir up excitement. Granary sounds like a sleepy corner of an old farm, or maybe your grandfather's favorite crossword clue. But in medieval castle life, granaries were the heart of survival. The quiet heroes. The difference between holding out for 10 months or 10 days. And these weren't just dusty sheds, no. Granaries in well-planned castles were engineering marvels, built with purpose. Stone floors and thick walls kept moisture from sneaking in. Ceilings were high and windows were tiny slits, just enough to allow air to flow without letting in dampness, or worse, visitors with fur and tiny paws. Yes, let's talk about them rats, because what good is 10 tons of barley if half of it becomes a rodent buffet? A single pair of rats can multiply into over $2,000 in just 1 year. That's not a colony, that's an army. And trust me, no castle steward wants to explain to the Lord why the grain reserve now squeaks. So castle designers got clever. Some granaries were elevated on stone pillars to stop rats from climbing up. Others had smooth plastered walls hard for little claws to grip. And there was always a cat or 2 or 10 prowling the corridors like 4-legged purring soldiers. No one in a castle ever said, just a cat. That cat was your front line against starvation. Now back to the grain itself. Oats, barley, rye. These weren't just filler, they were the foundation. a properly stored batch of barley, 3 years. Rye and wheat, 18 months. Oats, they fed both people and horses. Although by week 10 of oatmeal 3 times a day, you might start considering becoming a horse yourself just to justify the diet. The goal was to store enough grain to last at least a year, not just for the Lord and his family, but for the entire population hiding behind the walls. Soldiers, servants, stable hands, maybe a traveling bard who came at the wrong time and now regrets every life choice. Take Dover Castle, for example. Its granary could feed 256 people for over 10 months, and the Tower of London underground granaries could keep 3,000 souls going for weeks. That's not just storage, that's insurance. But grain storage wasn't a set it and forget it kind of deal. Moisture was the enemy. So stewards would rotate the stock spread grain out under the sun on dry days, toast it lightly, a process called parching, to drive out water and bacteria. It was a full-time job, carefully watching over thousands of pounds of beige-colored future porridge. Romantic, I know, and yet even the best-maintained granary couldn't provide everything. You can't fight on carbs alone. You need protein, fats, vitamins, something green, something chewable that isn't also used to patch roofs. But that's for later. For now, picture this. It's the second week of the siege. The gates are sealed. The air's getting tense. The horses are already being rationed down to oat dust. You walk past the granary, and a steward is checking the walls for cracks. A cat is chasing something into the shadows. You overhear someone mutter, "Dinner's coming." I hope it's not porridge again. Spoiler, it's definitely porridge again. And somehow, you're grateful, because in a world where the enemy wants to starve you out, a bowl of bland beige mush means you're still in the game. You wake up the next morning to the sound of scratching, not sword against shield, not a battering ram at the gate, but something smaller, more subtle, a soft, determined rustling behind the wooden wall where the grain is kept. You hold your breath, not out of fear, out of frustration, because if there's one thing medieval castle defenders feared more than invaders outside the walls, it was the invaders inside, the ones with whiskers, pink tails, and absolutely no respect for personal space or food security. Rats. The castle could have withstood months of siege with perfectly dry barley stacked in its granaries' oats, packed high in barrels, and rye sealed tight against the damp. But all of it could disappear, not to weather, not to mold, not to thieves, but to a family of rodents with a taste for survival and a reproductive cycle that made rabbits look lazy. Let's put it in perspective. One pair of rats, just one, could produce over 2,000 descendants in a single year, if left alone. That's not a pest problem. That's an invasion. A siege within a siege. And that's why cats weren't pets in medieval castles. No one in a besieged fortress was brushing Fluffy or tying bows around a kitten's neck. Castle cats were enlisted, deployed, knighted if you asked the cooks. They were more essential than some foot soldiers. While the men on the walls aimed at archers, the cats patrolled the shadows, stalking their four-legged enemies through rafters, barrels, and behind walls. A castle without cats. That wasn't bravery. That was a slow-motion famine. But rats weren't just after grain. Oh no, they had a taste for anything edible. If you stored it, they'd sniff it out. If you buried it, they'd dig it up. If you forgot it for even a day, they'd chew through it like little siege engineers with no respect for human effort. Salted meat, cheese, even candle wax if it had a hint of animal fat. So the castle's fight for survival wasn't just on the parapets, it was in the cellars, in the dark. It was fought with traps, cats, and long sticks, usually held by very tired people in linen caps who'd rather be anywhere else. Some granaries were designed to fight back, literally. You know how modern buildings have mouse-proofing? Well, castles had their own version. Some granaries were elevated on stone pillars with flat, smooth surfaces that rats couldn't climb. Others had special curved ledges that functioned like medieval anti-rodent moats. Everything was calculated to stop the "you just lost a month's worth of oats" problem. And the grain itself, while abundant, wasn't exactly exciting. Barley could last 3 years. Wheat and rye, maybe 18 months. Oats, great for people and horses, which, let's be honest, sometimes blurred into one. But eating the same thing every day for weeks on end, it does something to you. Imagine at every meal, a grayish bowl of mush. Morning oatmeal, midday reheated oatmeal with a sprig of dry something. Dinner, if you're lucky, toasted oatmeal. Surprise. A soldier once joked that oatmeal didn't taste like sadness, it was sadness. And still, it was better than nothing. The castle stewards knew this. That's why they took grain storage very seriously. On dry days, they'd spread the oats and barley out in the sun, rotating them to keep air flowing. They'd use techniques like parching lightly, toasting grain to remove moisture, making it last longer. They even had rotating stock systems, ensuring that the oldest grain got used first and nothing went bad quietly in the corner. Because in siege warfare, you don't just lose when the wall falls. You lose when you open a barrel and realize the bottom half is mold, rat droppings, and regret. And let's be real, eating rat-nibbled food is a uniquely medieval horror. Even if you scrape off the top layer, there's always that whisper in your mind, did I really get it all? This is why some castles designated rat guards. Real job title, real stakes. Men and women tasked with patrolling food storage daily, flashlightless, and armed only with brooms, cats, and a deeply personal hatred of rodents. These weren't glorious positions. No one wrote songs about Sir Edgar the Exterminator. But everyone ate because of them. Because again, sieges weren't about drama. They were about duration. The longest sieges weren't decided by catapults or swordplay, but by who ran out of breakfast first. Let's go back to the Tower of London. Its underground granaries were so well built, they could feed thousands of people for weeks, underground, protected from both rats and weather. Some stewards even went so far as to line grain barrels with dried herbs to deter pests. Because if you think medieval people didn't understand pest control, you haven't met a man who just lost half a winter's barley to a rat family reunion. You may have heard of the expression, don't put all your eggs in one basket. In a siege, the rule was don't leave any baskets where the rats can get to them. And so the dance continued. Cat chases rat. Rat eats grain. Grain feeds soldier. Soldier fights invader. And somewhere in the shadows, a tired steward wonders if it's worth the risk to nap for 30 minutes. You begin to understand that surviving a siege wasn't just about strength or strategy. It was about systems, quiet systems, repetitive systems, and above all, never letting the rats win. And so tonight, as you lie in bed listening to the soft shuffle of imagined mice, you may just find yourself whispering a quiet thanks to medieval cats everywhere. Unsung, unwashed, unbothered. The real heroes of castle cuisine. Let's say you've survived the first month. No one scaled the walls. No one starved yet. And despite the occasional rat funeral, the granaries are holding strong. But now the real test begins, not just for your supplies, but for your sanity. Because in a castle under siege, every grain becomes sacred. We're not just talking about storing food anymore. Now it's about keeping track, rotating it, stretching it and praying that mold doesn't decide to throw a surprise party inside your rye barrel. See, medieval castle life wasn't a Netflix show where time skips magically from day 1 to 10 weeks later. It was a slow, grinding routine filled with stewards checking grain levels like accountants with pitchforks. Let's start with numbers. In a typical large castle, the goal was to have enough grain to feed everyone for a year, and that wasn't some nice round estimate. It was math. Brutal daily survival math. You had to calculate how many people were inside the walls, how much each person needed per day, about 2 pounds of grain, give or take, how much spoilage to expect. Because yes, some grain would inevitably go bad or get eaten by pests despite your best efforts. And most importantly, how long will the siege last? Which, by the way, no one ever really knew. So stewards became food engineers. They created rotation systems where older grain was used first and replaced by newer stock. Grain was laid out under the sun on warm days to dry, stirred, and raked to prevent clumping. And on cold, damp days, fires were lit nearby, or grain was moved to warmer sections of the castle. Remember parching. It wasn't just a word to make you thirsty. It was a vital method. Lightly toasting grain before storing it removed residual moisture and extended its life dramatically. That sound of grains crackling in a pan wasn't just satisfying, it was survival. And yes, this was all done by hand. No machines, no moisture meters. Just decades of passed down wisdom, sniff tests, and the terrifying experience of opening a barrel and finding it furry. Now let's talk about the grain itself. Barley was the MVP. It was tough, reliable, and could last up to 3 years with proper care. It didn't taste amazing. But then again, nothing did by week 6. Still barley soup, barley bread, barley porridge. You get the idea. Barley was dinner, and breakfast, and dessert if you got creative. Wheat was a little more delicate. It lasted about 18 months, but it made better bread. And honestly, in the middle of a siege, bread that didn't taste like roof. Shingles was considered luxury cuisine. Oats. They pulled double duty, people ate them, horses ate them, and when the horses eventually became food, we'll talk about that later, they'd already been fattened on the same gruel you'd been choking down for weeks. The key wasn't just quantity, it was strategic redundancy. Castles didn't just have one big granary. They had multiple storage areas, often spread throughout the fortress. Some were underground, some hidden behind false walls. Some were quite literally in towers, not just for protection, but because the airflow was better at higher elevations. Why the paranoia? Simple. If the enemy breached a single storage room and that was your only stash, game over. But with supplies distributed and hidden, a single disaster didn't mean starvation. It just meant a really bad day. Let's look at Dover Castle again. Their main granary could feed over 250 people for 10 months. That's a remarkable feat when you remember there were no freezers, no plastic, no vacuum seals, just stone air and people with deep trust in the science of dry and dark. And then there was the Tower of London. Its underground grain silos were so massive and secure they could support thousands. And yes, some of these storage chambers were built beneath layers of earth and stone more protected than the king's throne room. This tells you something important. In medieval warfare, the pantry was just as critical as the armory. Want to survive a siege? Forget the boiling oil and crossbows. Invest in grain buckets and rat traps. And even then, even with every barrel sealed, every oat counted, every mouse chased down by your feline warriors, there was still the looming question, will it be enough? That's why castle stewards became obsessive. They didn't just track stocks, they measured decay rates. How fast was that rye losing color? How many weeks before this barley smelled wrong? Could you mix just a little bad grain with good and get away with it? Sometimes the answer was yes. Other times the answer was, oh no, followed by 3 soldiers with food poisoning and 1 very, very angry cook. You can almost imagine the conversations. Hey, why does this bread taste like sadness and mold? Because it's Tuesday. And yet, despite all this, the system usually worked. Why? Because discipline and boredom are powerful survival tools. In a siege, there's not much to do. No battles, no travel, no adventures. But there's always a barrel to check, always a mouse to chase, always a little more grain to shift. And so, day after day, hour after hour, the people inside those stone walls fought their quiet war, not with swords but with spoons, not with banners but with barley. And every bowl of porridge that didn't make you sick, that was victory. Let's say for just a moment that you're lucky enough to be in a castle with a fully stocked granary. Your oats are dry, your barley barrels are lined up like soldiers, and your cats are earning their keep. But after a few weeks, maybe months, you begin to feel it. Something missing. Not the enemy outside, not the smell of the stables. No, this is deeper. This is internal. This is your body screaming for protein. Because let's face it, as magical as porridge may be for surviving cold mornings, it doesn't build muscle, heal wounds, or keep soldiers battle ready on its own. You need more. You need meat. You need fat. You need cheese that doesn't dissolve into mush when the sun hits it. And this is where the true champions of siege nutrition step in: salted meat and hard cheese. Now, I know what you're thinking, how glamorous. But hear me out. These two weren't just snacks. They were strategic resources, carefully prepared, meticulously stored, and absolutely critical for survival. Let's start with the meat. Every autumn, before the first Frost Castle staff would hold what could only be described as a very grim barbecue prep party. Livestock that couldn't be fed through the winter pigs, cows, the occasional goat were slaughtered. Not for celebration, but for survival. And then salt, not a dash, not a sprinkle. We're talking buckets and barrels of the stuff. Meat would be packed so tightly in salt that modern chefs would faint just looking at it. No seasoning, no finesse, just salt, everywhere, like snow in a horror film. Why? Because salt pulls moisture out, and moisture is what bacteria and rot thrive on. Remove the moisture and the meat becomes what some might call preserved. Others might call it leathery sadness. But either way, it's edible. And in a siege, that's all that matters. Pork was the meat of choice. Easy to raise, easy to store, and quite fatty, meaning it packed calories, which was currency during a siege. A single pig salted and cured properly could yield 40 pounds of preserved meat, enough to feed a small family for several weeks, or one bored teenager for one night, depending on rationing. Beef less common. Cows were more valuable alive for their milk, for their size, for the social status that came with owning one. So beef was rarer. A luxury. Which is funny because nothing says luxury like gray salted beef that's been sitting in a wooden barrel for 5 months. And then there was fish. If your castle had access to a moat river or nearby coastline, congratulations, you had variety. Fish could also be salted and stored, and while it didn't exactly smell like victory, it didn't rot either, which in medieval terms was already a win. Speaking of smell, let's talk about the meat storage room. You ever open your fridge after a long vacation and find something unexpected? Now multiply that by 10. Add the aroma of dried blood, old wood, damp stone, and the ghost of 10,000 forgotten dinners. Congratulations, you're in a castle's meat cellar. And yet when someone opened that door and the air hit them like a hammer, they didn't run. They smiled. Because smell meant food, and food meant hope. Now let's pivot to cheese. Not your soft, creamy, brie-style delicacies. Oh no. We're talking hard cheese, like sharpen your knife before you serve it hard. Cheese that could double as a paperweight or in emergencies a blunt weapon. Fresh cheese spoiled quickly, but aged cheese. Properly dried and stored in cool conditions. It could last years. And it didn't require fancy tools, just patient salt and a bit of animal milk. Cow, sheep, goat, whatever you had on hand. Hard cheese was dense, durable, and in its own strange way, dependable. There are stories, real documented accounts of soldiers carrying hunks of cheese in their pouches, scraping pieces off with daggers like it was medieval jerky. Some even claimed that old cheese gave you stronger dreams. Although after chewing a piece for 30 minutes straight, most people probably just passed out from exhaustion. In Dover Castle records from the 13th century show, they prepared over 3,000 pounds of hard cheese in anticipation of a siege. That's the weight of a small car. Except, instead of being fast or sleek, it just sat there, waiting, like a quiet dairy tank of calories and hope. Cheese and meat together became the cornerstone of siege protein. No one was smiling while they chewed it. Medieval art shows plenty of grim faces, and now you know why. They weren't upset, they were tired of chewing. Because imagine this, you're cold. You're anxious. You haven't seen fresh fruit in weeks. And all you have is a slice of salt-packed pork and a wedge of cheese that tastes like time itself. And yet, it's enough. It gives your body strength. It gives your morale a strange, gritty lift. It gives you the sense that maybe you'll make it through. And so the barrels are stacked, the cheese wheels are waxed, the air in the storage room could knock out a dragon. But within those dark corners lies the key to your castle's survival. Not swords, not stones, just salt, fat, and an undying appreciation for food that refuses to die. Let's pause for a moment, because by now you've had your fill, figuratively and literally, of porridge, salted pork, and cheese so hard it could chip a tooth. Your castle is holding, your grain is dry, your meat is intact, your cheese still aggressive. But something's off, and it hits you not in the stomach but in the air. That smell. It starts as a background note like someone left a ham out in the sun just a little too long, then it thickens, becomes a presence. It crawls into your clothes, settles in your hair, and you realize it's the meat cellar. Yes, that sacred storage chamber, that lifeline of salt-packed survival. It's now alive in ways it shouldn't be, because as noble as salted meat and hard cheese may sound, in theory and practice they were a sensory assault, especially the smell. Imagine opening a barrel that's been sitting in the damp corner of a stone room for 6 months, filled with pig parts and dreams. Now multiply that by 20. And place the entire situation directly below your sleeping quarters. This wasn't just unpleasant. This was medieval aromatherapy gone wrong. Let's just say that by week 5 of the siege, no one was craving bacon anymore. The meat rooms were often sealed shut not to keep the food fresh, but to keep the air out. And if you were unlucky enough to be the one assigned to check inventory, well, you'd better hope your ancestors passed down the ability to breathe through your ears. Some poor steward clutching a torch and a wax tablet would make his way into the darkness note how many barrels were still sealed and probably lose his appetite for the rest of the week. Even the cats, the fearless rat-hunting champions of the granaries, gave the meat room a respectful distance. But here's the twist. Despite all that, no one complained. Not because they enjoyed the aroma of wet salt and doom, but because that smell meant something powerful. It meant they were still in the fight. It meant they still had food. That every sniff of rot and sour was a reminder that yes, the enemy may be patient, but so were they. And let's not forget the chewing. Salted meat wasn't tender. Cheese wasn't soft. Your jaw was in a permanent workout routine. One medieval chronicler even joked that siege survival was measured not in days, but in how many molars you had left, which is probably why so many medieval portraits feature closed mouths. No one was smiling. They were simply recovering from lunch. Soldiers joked, because they had to, that the real battle wasn't against the attackers outside the walls. It was against the cheese. Some slices were so aged they had names, legends. There was the Wheel of Doom from last winter, or Sir Crumble the Cheddar, who once chipped a dagger. And yet, these were badges of honor. Every meal that ended in soreness but satisfaction was a small victory. Now let's take a breather. If you're still awake and haven't wandered into your kitchen in search of a snack that doesn't fight back, just picture it. You're huddled in the corner of a dimly lit great hall. Outside, the enemy stirs. Inside, someone opens a barrel. The scent wafts through the air. A few groans echo through the corridor. But no one leaves. Instead, someone says, "Guess it's pork again." And someone else replies, "At least it's not tree bark yet." You all laugh, quietly, tired but warm, fed. You've seen a side of castle life that few talk about. Not the battles, not the kings, but the grind, the smell, the chewing, and even in the worst of it, there's pride. Because this is the heart of medieval resilience. It's not in glorious charges or fiery speeches. It's in enduring what you never thought you could, and maybe just maybe learning to find humor in it. So the next time you open your fridge and wonder what's for dinner, spare a thought for those who opened a meat barrel instead, and were grateful for the stench. Now, speaking of tree bark, that's actually not a joke. Because when the cheese runs out and the meat becomes a memory, you'd be amazed at what starts looking edible. But we'll get to that soon. For now, stretch your jaw. Take a deep breath, preferably not next to a barrel. And rest easy, knowing that if you were in that castle, you'd be surviving just fine. Hey, quick check, are you still with me? Or did you drift off somewhere between the third barrel of salted pork and the legendary Wheel of Doom cheddar? If you're awake, blink twice. If you're asleep, we'll dream gently of oatmeal and noble cats chasing rats and chainmail. Either way, no judgment. Honestly, if you've made it through 1,000 words about chewy cheese and meat sellers without dozing off, you deserve a medieval knighthood in bedtime resilience. Should I whisper softer or start describing porridge textures in excruciating detail? You let me know after your nap. So, you've got your granaries humming along your salted meat, stacked like chewy stone bricks, and your cheese wheels, aging so hard they could survive another century. But after weeks of nothing but oats, pork, and dairy rocks, something begins to stir deep inside the castle. Not rebellion, not enemy forces, something far more dangerous. The craving for something fresh, a carrot, a leaf, heck, even half a soggy onion would feel like a gift from the heavens at this point. Because as it turns out, surviving on salted protein and porridge isn't exactly nature's multivitamin. Scurvy didn't just haunt sailors, it crept into stone castles, whispering with bleeding gums and aching joints. But medieval defenders weren't entirely helpless. No, they had a secret weapon, nestled quietly behind stone walls, hidden in the shadows of towers and tucked between buttresses, the castle garden. Now, before you picture sprawling fields or perfectly manicured herb rows, let's scale those expectations way down. These weren't Versailles. They were kitchen gardens, compact, stubborn little patches of soil tucked into courtyards, behind kitchens, along sunny walls, anywhere the enemy couldn't burn or trample. And these patches, they saved lives. Let's walk through one. You push open a creaky wooden gate into a tiny square space, maybe 20 steps across. The air smells faintly of damp earth and thyme. And the plants? Well, they're not Instagram ready, but they're alive. And that's more than you can say for the salted fish in your last stew. The top plants on the siege survival list, onions and leeks. Why? Because they keep. You can hang them in bunches, braid them into ropes, or just chuck them in a cold corner, and they'll wait patiently until needed. Also, they do wonders for flavor. Let's be honest, oatmeal tastes better with anything, but especially onions. Garlic came next. A 2-for-1 deal, food and medicine. Medieval defenders didn't know about microbes, but they did know that garlic somehow helped with infections, bad breath, and annoying neighbors. Cabbage was the tank of the medieval garden. Frost survived. Neglect thrived. Siege. No problem. It just kept growing, sometimes bitter, always tough. Just like the people who ate it. And then there were the herbs. You haven't truly lived until you've tried to cheer up a starving soldier with a wilted sprig of mint, but that mint, it helped. It soothed stomachs destroyed by salted meat. It made the air a little fresher, and maybe it reminded people that green things still existed. Sage, thyme, rosemary. These weren't luxuries. They were medicine cabinets in leaf form, used for teas, poultices, meat preservation, and making your 100th bowl of pottage slightly less tragic. And while we're romanticizing tiny plants, let's talk about how medieval gardeners were surprisingly scientific. They used raised beds to help the soil warm up faster and drain better. They planted against south-facing walls, which absorbed sunlight by day and radiated warmth by night, a medieval greenhouse effect without the glass. At Conwy Castle in Wales, gardeners even planted in vertical layers. Vines climbed up walls, leafy greens stretched across mid-level spaces, root vegetables burrowed below. 3 dimensions of nutrition in one compact plot. Not bad for a garden the size of a modern studio apartment. And it gets better. A well-tended garden of just 20 square yards could provide enough vegetables to supplement the diets of 10 people for months, which might explain why guards started assigning more soldiers to protect the cabbage patch than the Eastern Tower. Because fresh greens didn't just feed the body, they fed morale. Picture this. You've spent 4 straight weeks in a gray stone castle staring at gray enemy tents, eating gray food. Then one day you turn a corner and you see a tiny green leaf pushing out of the dirt. And somehow you feel better. Not full, not safe, but alive. A single garden was like a breath of spring tucked into a season of hunger. It gave color to meals, hope to the weary, and on bad days something to stare at besides the wall. Gardens also gave people something to do. During a siege, you couldn't exactly pop out for a jog, but you could weed a cabbage row, you could water the mint, you could whisper to your onions like they were old friends, and sometimes they were. But let's be clear, gardens weren't enough. You couldn't survive a siege on parsley and optimism alone. The yields were small, the growing season short, and the enemies rarely generous with the weather. Which brings us to the next trick: preservation. Because when summer gave you vegetables, you had to stretch them through the winter. Enter the world of pickling. But before we dive into brine barrels and medieval sauerkraut, take a breath. You've wandered through a cabbage patch, smelled fresh mint for the first time in weeks, and remembered that siege life wasn't all rats and rock-hard cheese. It also had gardens, tiny green oases in a world of stone and smoke. They didn't end the siege, but they reminded you that spring would come again. Eventually, so. Your garden is thriving well as much as any dirt patch surrounded by stone walls during a military siege can thrive. You've got onions sunning themselves like royalty on a windowsill cabbage, holding the line like leafy little soldiers, and a few heroic herbs growing defiantly in the cracks between paving stones. But as the months drag on, fresh greens become fewer, and every day starts to feel a little more beige. Beige walls, beige skies, beige soup. So what did medieval defenders do when their gardens couldn't keep up? They turned to one of the greatest culinary survival tricks in history: pickling. Yes, pickling. It may not sound glamorous, and it certainly doesn't smell glamorous, but in the medieval world, this humble process was a time machine. It let you take a piece of summer, vibrant, crisp, juicy, and carry it with you deep into the darkest winter weeks of a siege. Here's how it worked. First, you harvested everything you could before frost or enemy fire could get to it. Carrots, beets, onions, cabbage, turnips, anything that grew underground or near enough. Sometimes even fruits, if you had them, and fish if you were lucky. Then you cleaned it, blanched it if necessary, and packed it tightly into wooden barrels or ceramic crocks. Not casually, not with flair, tightly, like every square inch of space mattered because it did. Then came the brine, a mix of salt, vinegar, water, and spices poured in until everything was submerged, then sealed, with wax or cloth or carefully carved wooden lids. And then you waited and waited. Pickles weren't just food, they were little acts of faith. You prepared them in the warm months, hoping they'd be edible when everything else turned cold, damp, or rotten. And surprisingly often, they were. Let's talk cabbage. Fermented cabbage sauerkraut was a siege superfood, not just because it lasted, but because it delivered vitamin C, the anti-scurvy champion. One spoonful could do more for your health than a week of oatmeal and salted pork. Records from the siege of Kenilworth Castle in 1266 mention defenders still eating pickled cabbage nearly a year into the siege. A year. You can imagine the morale boost that must have brought. We may be surrounded by enemies, but we have crunch and the variety not in flavor. Let's not exaggerate, but in color, texture, and chewiness. You had pickled carrots, sweetish firm, pickled onions, bitey pungent, pickled beets, suspiciously purple, pickled turnips, a gamble every time. It wasn't fine dining, but it was survival with flair. And there was something comforting about pulling out a jar or barrel, opening it slowly, and getting hit by the sharp, vinegary punch of a summer long gone, like a slap to the nose and a hug to the soul simultaneously. Now here's where things get clever. Some castles didn't just store pickled food, they stored it in secret. Yes, actual food hidden in underground cellars, disguised wall compartments, and deep stone alcoves with decoy doors. Because if the enemy ever did breach the walls, defenders didn't want to lose their last line of defense, the pickles. At Dover Castle, an inventory from 1289 listed 78 barrels of pickled vegetables, carefully stacked and cataloged, not just for nutrition, but for morale. Because let's face it, the moment you have to boil your leather shoes into soup, you start looking back fondly on the turnip you didn't appreciate last week. Pickled foods didn't just fill bellies, they preserved memory. They were symbols of foresight, preparation, and the sheer stubbornness of medieval people to eat anything but despair. And the science of it surprisingly solid. The vinegar killed off bacteria. The salt prevented spoilage. The sealed containers kept air out and flavor in, and the longer the pickles sat, the more potent they became, sometimes improving with age, like a vinegary fine wine that no one actually wanted to drink. Did they taste good? Depends who you ask. Some folks loved them, others tolerated them. But everyone agreed when you opened that barrel and pulled out something that didn't smell like death or disappointment that was a good day. Even kids got into it. Children would sneak into the pickle stores just to sniff them. Some pretended they were magical potions. Others used them as bribes in stone courtyard games. Trade you one beet slice for your spot near the fire. Deal. And yes, sometimes there were mishaps. Imagine the chaos when someone forgot to seal a lid properly and a whole barrel went bad. That wasn't just a loss. That was a siege-level tragedy. Fights broke out. Blame was assigned. Poems were written. The ballad of the spoiled onion still sung in some kitchens today. Probably. But most of the time the system worked. Because people took care, they paid attention. They knew that one jar of pickled cabbage might mean the difference between one more week of life or one less. And here's the thing. Pickles gave you control. In a world where so much was uncertain, enemy movements, supply lines, weather, there was something deeply comforting about food that obeyed the rules. Slice, salt, seal, wait, and trust that when you needed it most, it would still be there, waiting. So tonight, if you open your fridge and see a lonely pickle jar on the bottom shelf, give it a little nod. It might not be much, but to a medieval defender, it was the taste of hope in a time of hunger. By now you've seen the ingenuity. The grain stored above the reach of rats. The meat soaked in salt like it was training for a mineral spa. The cabbage defying all odds. And the pickles, glorious vinegary pickles standing guard in their barrels like the last line of edible defense. But what if I told you that behind all those clever systems there was still one more trick up the medieval castle's sleeve? Something secret, something dangerous, something that didn't rely on soil salt or sun. Tunnels? Yes. Real, narrow, dark, winding, secret tunnels. Because sometimes even the best storage plans fell short. And when the grain was running low, the pigs had turned into jerky and the cabbage was more ghost than leaf. You needed a miracle, or at least a sneaky merchant. Many castles across Europe were built with hidden passageways, narrow tunnels carved through rock or constructed beneath outer walls. Some were barely large enough to crawl through. Others, elaborate networks with trap doors, false turns, and dead ends designed to fool intruders. To the untrained eye, they were just drainage paths. To the desperate, they were lifelines. Because if the enemy thought you were sealed in slowly starving, they were in for a surprise. Behind their backs, sometimes right beneath their tents, your allies were crawling through the earth with bags of onion, salted fish, maybe even news from the outside world. Let's be clear, this was not easy. These weren't smooth, torch-lit fantasy tunnels. They were cold, damp, cramped, and often smelled like despair and mildew. You had to crouch, then crawl, then hold your breath and pray you didn't get stuck behind the guy carrying a barrel of pickled beets. And the risk, enormous. If you were caught by enemy patrols emerging from the ground like a mole holding a sack of cheese, your day ended very badly. Executions weren't just possible, they were expected. But for those who pulled it off, they were heroes. Unsung, shadow-lurking, bribe-accepting heroes. Some tunnels had one-way drop shafts. You could enter from inside the castle, but not easily come back up if you were chased. Others had built-in booby traps, trip lines, collapsible walls, even little pits where only one person could pass at a time. Not ideal for smugglers, but excellent for confusing, angry soldiers. And here's the fun part. The enemy often knew. These tunnels existed, but they didn't know where. So entire days were wasted digging, searching, and occasionally accidentally tunneling into someone's latrine. Meanwhile, inside the castle, defenders sat around chewing on newly arrived apples and pretending to be hungry. At Carisbrooke Castle, legend tells of a merchant who delivered barrels of flour through a tunnel during a 14th century siege. He charged 10 times the usual price, but he got paid. Because what's money compared to bread? At Kenilworth, there were rumors of tunnel smuggling so elaborate, it was said the enemy eventually tried to smoke the exits out with wet hay. Did it work? Not really. Mostly they just made the entire hillside smell like sad soup. The tunnels weren't just for food. Sometimes they brought in messages, spices, even the occasional goat. Although, to be fair, smuggling a goat through a narrow tunnel is a choice. An ambitious one. But why go to all this trouble? Because sometimes even the best prepared castles ran out. Because sieges weren't quick. They could last months, even years. And you could only eat pickled turnips for so long before someone looked at their boots a little too long. So the tunnels became more than emergency exits. They were a mental safety net. Proof that someone out there still remembered you, still believed you were worth sneaking a sack of onions to. But don't get too romantic. The tunnels weren't just used by the good guys. Every now and then attackers found them too. And when that happened, they didn't deliver food, they delivered fire. A successful breach through a forgotten tunnel could mean doom. Some sieges ended not with a battering ram, but with a single enemy soldier popping up through the floorboards like a very angry prairie dog. So castles got smarter, tunnels were mapped, sealed. Some had false ends, so if you followed them blindly, you ended up staring at a wall, or worse, back outside the castle where you started. One account even mentions a trap chamber designed to collapse if you stepped in the wrong spot. Congratulations, you've triggered the medieval escape room. But most of the time the tunnels worked. They kept hope alive, food flowing, and morale just high enough to avoid eating the last cheese wheel named Sir Crumble. Of course, you couldn't rely on tunnels forever. They were risky, limited, and no amount of secret onions could replace full-scale resupply. But in the darkest moments of siege life, when the sky was gray, the firewood low, and your last meal tasted like something better, left unmentioned, hearing that soft tap on the trapdoor. That meant everything. So tonight, when you hear a creak in the hallway, imagine it's not your pipes. It's a brave, muddy merchant emerging from a tunnel beneath your bed, carrying a small sack of apples and 3 wheels of goat cheese. Because sometimes survival is about more than rations and walls. Sometimes it's about the dirt beneath your feet and the people willing to crawl through it to keep you going. Let's imagine it's week 12 of the siege. You've eaten enough oats to become emotionally bonded with horses. You've had meat so salted it whispers back. You've pickled everything but your own boots. And yes, you've even accepted that someone named a cheese wheel Sir Crumble. And no one finds that weird anymore. But now comes the next chapter in your castle survival journey. A chapter that frankly is loud, smelly, and occasionally tries to chew on your cloak. We're talking about livestock, the animals that didn't get salted, pickled, or stewed in week one. Because when word of an approaching army reached a castle, defenders didn't just brace the gates and sharpen the spears. They also gathered the animals. Chickens, goats, pigs, sheep, even cows were herded inside the walls like VIP guests at a very chaotic barnyard convention. This wasn't out of kindness. This was mobile food storage. They were walking, clucking, mooing rations with legs. At first, the idea makes sense. Fresh milk from cows and goats, eggs from chickens, a source of meat later if things went long, plus you could keep breeding them, at least in theory. But reality? Well, the reality was more complicated. The moment those castle gates slammed shut behind the last pig, your noble fortress became a very expensive barn. Take the inner bailey, the main courtyard of a castle. Once a place for drilling soldiers, drying laundry, or watching the sunset while pretending not to smell the moat. Now it's full of animals. Pigs rooting in the dirt. Chickens squawking from rafters. Goats climbing on anything not nailed down. Sheep looking vaguely guilty for reasons unknown. And the sound non-stop. You're trying to have a serious meeting about the grain situation when a rooster declares war from atop a barrel. Someone sneezes. A pig responds. A goat knocks over a torch. It's chaos. And then there's the smell. Remember all that careful planning about food storage? Well, the animals don't care. They're doing what animals do where they want when they want. And unless your castle came with built-in drainage, which some did but most didn't, you're now dealing with very medieval plumbing issues. Waste had to be collected daily. Some was dumped in pits. Some dried and used as fuel. Some was simply endured. At Caernarfon Castle in Wales, archaeological evidence suggests wooden platforms were built to elevate animals off the ground. Not for comfort, but to keep the courtyard from turning into a mud pie nightmare. And feeding them right. The animals don't just survive on air and high hopes. Castle stewards had to budget grain not just for people but for livestock. Chickens were easy kitchen scraps and bugs. Pigs, they'd eat anything. Goats. Well, goats would try to eat your curtains, your boots, your dignity. And cows. Cows are lovely, but they're grain-eating machines. You don't get milk for free. You pay in hay, oats, and noise. So yes, the animals were useful. But they were also exhausting. And yet, there was a strange comfort to having them nearby. In the dead of winter, when the castle walls howled with wind and your chamber was cold enough to refrigerate cheese, which ironically made it softer, some defenders would sleep near the larger animals for warmth. Imagine curling up next to a cow, not because you want to, but because it's either that or freeze, and the cow just stares at you, chewing slowly, judging perhaps, but also radiating 1,000 pounds of glorious body heat. It wasn't cozy, but it was survival. And then, of course, came the inevitable. As the siege dragged on and the pickled turnips ran dry, people began making hard decisions. One by one, the animals became meals. Chickens disappeared first. No one mourned too loudly. Then pigs, then goats. Until finally even the cows, those warm, lumbering friends, were led away. There's a strange kind of sorrow in eating something that once shared your living space. It's not like eating meat from a cold storage barrel. It's eating a former roommate. People didn't talk much on those days, and yet they accepted it because every bite meant one more day. And when it comes to sieges, one more day can be everything. Sometimes animals weren't even eaten. They were traded a pig for grain, a goat for a cask of wine. Sometimes they were sacrificed to distract enemy scouts, and occasionally they escaped. Imagine the chaos of a lone sheep bolting out an open gate during a night raid. Enemy soldiers pause. A confused bleat echoes, and somewhere a castle guard mutters, "Well, there goes dinner." Still, for all the trouble livestock caused, noise, waste, ration stress, they were a crucial part of the siege puzzle. They gave milk, they gave warmth, they gave protein, and bizarrely, they gave comfort. Because even when everything else felt like it was unraveling, the gentle cluck of a hen or the soft snort of a piglet reminded people life was still happening, even in a cage of stone and fear. And when the siege finally ended, however it ended, the animals that survived were often celebrated, given names, moved to safer quarters, maybe spared from the stew pot out of sheer gratitude. Because in the end, it wasn't just the warriors or the walled defenses that got people through. It was every hoof, every feather, every braying, snorting, clattering beast that turned a fortress into something human. Hey, just checking, are you still awake, or did I lose you somewhere between bark bread and candle soup? If you're dreaming about chewy leather and politically charged parchment stew, I totally understand. But if you're still here, blink once, or just whisper rat casserole into the void. By now you've seen how far a castle will go to feed its people grain silos stacked like treasure vaults, cheese aged until its emotionally complex gardens squeezed into every sunlit corner, and even livestock turned into snorting roommates. But eventually, all the systems start to break. The grain barrels grow light, the meat rooms echo, the chicken's gone, the pickles a fading memory. And that's when siege cuisine enters its final form. A phase so strange, so resourceful, so profoundly unsettling that even the rats start looking nervous. Welcome to the era of desperation meals. Let's begin gently with bread. Not fresh, warm, fluffy bread. Not even the dense, chewy kind you could build a wall with. We're talking about stale, fossil-grade loaves, so dry and hard they had to be soaked in broth, wine milk, or whatever liquid hadn't turned weird yet, just to be chewable. And once softened into a sort of paste, they were mixed with herbs, onion scraps, or pickled juice, and served proudly as siege stew. Bon appetit. But bread was only the start, because after the grain was gone and the stale loaves were reduced to dust, defenders turned to something that sounds cozy, until you understand what it meant back then. Bone broth. Now we love bone broth today. It's trendy, it's gut healing. But in a siege, it wasn't made with grass-fed, locally sourced bones. It was made with whatever was left. Bones boiled once, then again, and again. Up to 7 times. Each batch weaker, thinner, more philosophical. By round 5, you weren't eating soup, you were just hoping. And when there were no more bones, people got creative. Some turned to tree bark, stripped from doors, beams, or even furniture. Elm and pine bark was shaved, dried, ground, and added to flour as filler. Yes, you heard that right. People made bark bread, crispy, nutty, possibly splintery, but still technically food. Others got even more inventive. At the 1462 siege of Bamberg Castle, defenders reportedly boiled leather hinges from doors, leather straps from armor, even old shoes. Yes, shoe soup was real, and you didn't complain, because if it was soft enough to chew and didn't poison you, immediately it counted. People joked that if it couldn't run away, it went in the pot. Some folks probably even eyed the furniture legs with suspicion. Is that chair oak or dinner? Then there was candle wax. Now before you panic, no, people weren't eating the wax you buy at home goods stores. These were tallow candles made from animal fat, and when oil ran out, melting tallow was one of the few ways to add calories to soup. Greasy, absolutely. Weirdly satisfying, maybe. Will you dream about it after hearing this? Also, yes. And then, of course, the rats. Early in the siege, rats were the enemy. They ate your grain, spoiled your stores, outwitted your cats. But when food vanished, the rats themselves became dinner. Locally sourced, cage-free, definitely organic. Children were paid to catch them sometimes, rewarded with extra scraps of bread. 12 rats caught in a day might earn you 2 slices of crust and the envy of your hungry peers. Were they tasty? Depends who you ask. But after months of salted leather and bark paste, even a rat seemed festive. Some defenders got very creative. One cook was said to have earned a silver coin for making 30 meals from a single chicken. 30. How, no one knows. We just hope it didn't involve time travel. Then came the parchment paste. Yes, old scrolls, legal documents, treaties, written history scraped clean, boiled into protein-rich paste. Not only did it feed you, it erased paperwork. Sorry, my lord, we can't find the marriage contract. Oh, no. What a tragedy. Please pass the ink stew. And finally, the shields. During the 1215 siege of Rochester Castle, records claim, defenders began eating their shields. These were made of wood, hide, and glue, 3 things that boiled long enough become something vaguely edible. Not good, not healthy, but edible. And that was the only metric that mattered. Even boots weren't safe. Boiled until soft, chewed like jerky, and probably followed by deep, reflective silence. You start to understand why, by the end of long sieges, no one wanted to talk about the menu. The food didn't just challenge your body, it tested your identity. You weren't a knight or a baker or a scribe anymore. You were a person who just chewed a corner of your own helmet lining and called it dinner. And yet, people survived. Because hunger rewrites the rules. Because the human mind, when pushed, finds a way to justify even door stew. And when the gates finally opened, whether by victory or surrender, those who'd lived through it carried a look in their eyes. A look that said, I once ate something that used to be nailed to a wall. So next time you open your fridge, stare into the glow of abundance and think, ugh, nothing looks good tonight. Just remember, there was a time when someone's favorite dish was soup made from yesterday's boot. And they were proud of it. So, now that we've chewed our way through soup, made of shoes, scrolls, and shields, you might be thinking surely we've reached the end of medieval creativity, right? Oh no. Because there was one more source of nourishment in a besieged castle that no one talks about at fancy dinner parties. Not the lords, not the soldiers, not the history books. But I will, because it's time we talk about the children. No, don't panic. This isn't going where your sleep-deprived brain might be drifting. What I mean is when the siege hit month 3 or 4, and the adults were too tired to even lift a stale crust of bread without sighing dramatically. It was the children who became the rat catchers. Yes, professional tiny hunters. Picture it, barefoot, fast, armed with small sticks and a grudge. These kids would skitter through storage rooms, under tables, behind barrels, chasing down the very thing everyone used to scream at. Rats. Once the greatest threat to your oats, these squeaky invaders had become something far more important, dinner. And the kids? They made it happen. It started casually. A boy in the kitchen caught one and brought it in proudly. Everyone laughed. until the cook picked it up, gave it a little nod, and said, "Clean it, we're boiling it." After that, the job caught on. Castle stewards began assigning kids to rat patrol. Some even got rewarded a small piece of bread, an extra cup of broth, or, if they were very lucky, a spot near the fire for a night. One record from a besieged castle mentions a boy who caught 12 rats in a single day and was paid in 2 whole slices of bread. That's practically a feast. A medieval bonus, a carbohydrate promotion. And the children took their jobs seriously. They developed systems, bait stations, quiet traps made of clay pots and string. Some even made songs about catching rats, which, if we're being honest, probably sounded adorable until you remembered what the chorus was about. There's something oddly heartwarming about it, really. In a time of fear, hunger, and hopelessness, the youngest members of society stepped up, not with swords, not with speeches, but with quick hands and quiet feet. They became the tiny backbone of castle nutrition, and in a weird, slightly crunchy way, they gave hope, because as long as you were still catching rats, you were still fighting back. And while we're here, let's talk about those rats for a moment. Early on, they were the enemy. They chewed through sacks of barley, spoiled salted meat, outsmarted traps, and dodged cats with Olympic precision. But in desperation, they became the hunted. And not just for food. Some defenders turned the rat hunting into a game, a way to distract the mind from hunger. People placed bets, set up mini tournaments. Who could catch the biggest rat, who caught the most in an hour, who managed to bring in one that still looked mildly edible. One steward reportedly named his 3 best rat hunters the Chew Crew. We don't know what became of them, but I like to think they became legends. And of course, the cook had to get creative. You couldn't just toss a rat on a plate and call it dinner. You had to disguise it, flavor it, market it. Some were stewed, others roasted on skewers. A few turned into fillings for makeshift pies. You might hear someone ask, "What's in this?" And the cook would shrug and reply, "Don't ask, just chew." And yet, as strange as it sounds, no one complained, because every bite, no matter how small or suspicious, was a reminder that you were still here, still holding on, still chewing. In fact, some defenders grew attached to their rat hunting teams. They were praised, protected, even bragged about. My son caught 15 yesterday. Mine caught one the size of a chicken. Mine brought in 2 and made a necklace out of the tails. Okay, that last one might have been a little much, but you get the idea. And over time, the rats dwindled. Not because they got scared, but because they got eaten. The great irony. By the end of some sieges, the castle had fewer rats than it did chickens. That's not just survival. That's medieval population control. But perhaps the most poignant part of this strange chapter is what it says about the resilience of community. Because even when the world outside was on fire, even when grown men argued over the last sprig of thyme, even when parchment soup was a legitimate dinner option, the children still found purpose. They still laughed. They still ran. And in doing so, they reminded everyone that life continued, even if that life included skewered rodents and celebratory rat pies. So tonight, as you tuck yourself under warm blankets in a rat-free room, give a little mental salute to the unsung heroes of siege cuisine. Not the stewards, not the cooks, not even the cats, but the children with muddy feet, determined faces and hands, quick enough to turn pests into protein, the last line of defense, the bravest little scavengers in all the land. And tomorrow they'll be up early, chasing shadows, earning bread, saving the day, one squeak at a time. So the children had their mission, the rats had their fate, and the grown-ups, while they were busy doing something equally peculiar, they were inventing fake meals. Yes, you heard that right. Somewhere between week 6 and 8 of a brutal siege, when your stomach has forgotten what full feels like, and your dreams are just reruns of cheese wheels rolling down hills, you start getting creative. And thus began the curious phenomenon of imaginary banquets. These were not hallucinations. They were social events. Entire evenings where the castle's inhabitants would gather together not to eat, but to pretend to eat. Yes, welcome to the medieval potluck of make-believe. People would sit on wooden benches, hold empty bowls, and describe their dishes in ridiculous detail. Tonight I'm serving roasted goose, stuffed with figs, almonds, and hope. Ah, lovely. I brought a stew made of unicorn tears and barley soaked in laughter. Oh, and here's my specialty air pie with invisible crust and not a single calorie. And somehow it helped. They would chew the air slurp. Nothing raise pretend goblets in honor of a meal that existed only in their minds. Because sometimes you didn't need food to feed the body. You needed joy to feed the spirit. And laughter. It was calorie-free. But don't think for a moment that medieval defenders were all whimsy and rat pies. They were also tactical cunning and a little bit sneaky. Let's talk about food illusions, the art of tricking the enemy into thinking you had plenty of supplies left, even when you were one bite away from chewing your own boots. It was classic siege psychology. Imagine this. You're an attacker, starving, and shivering in the mud outside the castle. You look up and see defenders tossing down loaves of bread. But they're throwing away bread. Well, that must mean they've got more than enough. Maybe it's time to call off the siege. What you don't realize is that those loaves are just cleverly shaped clumps of sawdust dyed with soot and oil and hurled with a wink. Another trick. Fattening a single cow to parade on the walls every few days. Same cow, different hat. Maybe a flower crown on Tuesday and a red sash on Friday. To the enemy, it looks like a steady supply of fresh meat. To the defenders, it's Daisy doing her bit for castle morale. One siege account tells of a goat named Buttercup who wore 5 different cloaks, 3 hats, and even had her horns polished with wax, just to look like multiple animals. She was a one-goat livestock illusion squad, and while the enemy outside grew more demoralized, the defenders inside found tiny ways to lift their spirits, even if their bellies remained tragically empty. One night, a group of guards staged a fake cooking contest. They picked ingredients out of thin air. I'm using dragon marrow and cinnamon, and then described their imaginary dishes to a blindfolded judge. The winner, a guard who claimed to make a mousse out of snowflakes clover and old sermons. It was light pious and full of regret, according to the judge. A not Michelin-starred, but definitely memorable. Then there was the art of passing time without panic. When you're stuck inside thick stone walls with limited food, too much tension, and the lingering smell of boiling parchment, you need more than just imaginary soup to keep going. You need games. Simple, silly games. Some played Name That Smell, which was exactly what it sounds like and often ended in both laughter and regret. Others played Rock or Bread, a guessing game involving throwing small brown lumps at the wall to see if they bounced. Hint bread doesn't bounce. There was also Guess the Ingredient, where someone would describe a dish they used to love as a child, and others would try to reconstruct the recipe using only 3 actual ingredients and a ton of imagination. And for the kids, oh, they invented a sport called barrel rolling derby. 2 children would climb inside old barrels, roll down a hallway, and whoever could stay upright longest without vomiting or crashing into a monk won. Prizes were imaginary, of course, but pride was real. All these odd rituals served one purpose: to remind people that life existed beyond the siege, that joy, even pretend joy, was worth chasing, and that sometimes the strongest weapon wasn't a sword or a boiling cauldron, it was hope disguised as nonsense. But speaking of weapons, have you ever wondered how a castle kept its food supplies hidden from would-be raiders? Or what happened when someone betrayed that secret? Well, let's roll right into that next, because you'll want to keep your torch lit for this one. By now you might be wondering, where exactly were these precious food supplies stored? You know, the real ones. Not the imaginary goat soufflés or invisible cheese wheels, but the actual edible stuff. Well, castles had their secrets, and these secrets were usually below your feet. Welcome to the underground pantries, hidden storage rooms, and cleverly disguised cellars that made castle life at least temporarily livable during a siege. The first rule of medieval food stockpiling: don't put all your salted eggs in one basket, literally and figuratively. Every well-prepared castle kept multiple storage areas separated by walls, floors, and occasionally false doors. If a section got breached or contaminated, say by mold rats or overly curious monks, there was always a backup. Or 2. Some of these storage rooms were under trapdoors, accessible only by lifting heavy slabs of stone in places no one would look twice, like a quiet corner of the chapel or under the bishop's favorite reading bench. One particularly clever castle had food stashed behind a rotating fireplace wall. Pull the right iron hook and the entire hearth would swivel to reveal sacks of oats, wheels of hard cheese, and barrels of dried beans. Medieval Batman would have been proud, but secrecy came at a cost, because nothing endangers a food stash like gossip. Once during a siege in 1384, a kitchen boy named Tobin accidentally let it slip during a dice game that Father Anselm's wine stash is behind the third statue on the left, just under the Virgin Mary's foot. By morning, the enemy had redirected their catapults. The Virgin Mary didn't make it. Neither did the wine. So yes, silence was golden, and sometimes it tasted like pickled herring. Of course, food wasn't always safe, even when hidden. Some pantries became home to molds so aggressive they practically had their own zip codes. Others had to be guarded not just from enemies, but from the castle's own residents, whose loyalty wavered after week 7 without a proper meal. One chronicler writes of a knight who tried to bribe a guard with a single dried plum. A single plum. It worked. Security measures became weirdly advanced. Some castles used decoy pantries rooms that looked stocked, but only held empty barrels or spoiled goods. They were the medieval version of a dummy safe. Others placed noisy traps, loose stones, hanging pots, or creaky floorboards to alert guards if anyone tried sneaking in at night. If the clang of an old ladle falling on your head didn't stop you, the shame of being caught certainly might. And just when you think you've heard it all, enter the food testers. No, not royal tasters checking for poison, though those existed too, but people tasked with smelling stored food daily, just sniffing barrels all day. Oh, yep, this oat barrel's gone funky. This cheese wheel, It's fine if you like your cheddar slightly possessed. This dried meat smells like ambition and regret. They were the unsung heroes of siege cuisine. But despite all this planning, storage, and sniffing, one truth remained. You had to make things last, and that meant rationing. If you think modern diets are strict, try surviving on 1 pow 4 of a turnip and 6 boiled barley seeds per day. Medieval rationing charts were terrifying. Some were carved into wooden slates, others scratched into stone. They told you exactly how much you could eat and when. Breakfast, a cup of thin porridge and half a stale apple. Lunch broth, made from yesterday's broth, thickened with imaginary carrots. Dinner, 1 biscuit shared between 3 people, and a prayer for tomorrow. Water, too, was rationed, which is why ale, yes, even the watered-down kind, remained essential. It wasn't just for fun, it was survival juice. And people got creative. Breadcrumbs were recycled into porridge. Meat bones were boiled until they crumbled, then reboiled, just in case the flavor gods had left anything behind. Even used cooking water from boiling root scraps or suspicious mushrooms was stored and reused until it tasted like sadness. But here's the twist. Some of these siege recipes, they stuck around. To this day, certain peasant stews and rustic porridges trace their roots back to desperate castle cooks, trying not to die creatively. It's a weird kind of culinary legacy, one where survival cuisine becomes heritage cuisine. And now whenever you dip a crust of bread into onion broth somewhere deep in your genetic memory, a little castle cook from 1422 gives you a wink. But as sieges dragged on weeks becoming months, supplies dwindling, morale unraveling, there was always one last line of defense. The castle garden. Let's pull back the curtain. Yes, that's coming in the next part. You step outside, well, not really outside as in out in the open, because that would mean stepping into arrow range, but into a walled inner courtyard, perhaps behind the great hall, or tucked beside the chapel. This is where the real miracle of castle survival quietly unfolded, the siege garden. If medieval food stockpiles were the insurance plan, then gardens were the emergency bailout, the last hope, when everything else was either eaten rotted or traded for someone's last pair of shoes. These gardens weren't sprawling aesthetic displays. They didn't have fountains, marble cherubs, or lazy butterflies landing on roses. They were dense, stubborn, and often hidden in plain sight. Small rectangular plots, elevated beds made from leftover timber, even planter boxes carved out of broken wagons. And what did they grow? Well, imagine the saddest salad you've ever seen. Leeks, onions, garlic, turnips, cabbages, and maybe, if luck struck, some bitter herbs or a handful of field peas. No tomatoes, no potatoes, no bell peppers. This was pre-Columbian Europe, after all. These were plants with roots deep in dirt and even deeper in practicality, because the goal wasn't taste. It was not dying. Some castles even grew crops in chamber pots. Yes, those chamber pots. Sanitized, of course. Hopefully. And repurposed as planters, they became the medieval version of hydroponics, minus the fancy LEDs. Water was hauled in buckets. Fertilizer. Let's just say it was readily available and organic before organic was a thing. And every square inch of sunlight that touched stone or soil was used. But gardening under siege wasn't just about planting and waiting. It was a high-stakes gamble. If attackers spotted your garden, they might aim flaming arrows directly at it. If your own people got too hungry, they might raid it at night, pulling up baby carrots and munching on unripe beans like guilty raccoons in armor. So guards had to protect the greenery. Some castles had garden shifts, 2 men posted at all times with very specific instructions. If anyone eats the cabbage early, we all go down. Imagine losing your life over a sprout. Still, these gardens provided more than calories. They offered routine, tending to a plant, watering it, trimming dead leaves, checking for aphids gave residents a sense of control. Amid the chaos, the arrows and the starvation, the act of gardening was oddly grounding, pun intended. Even children were involved, too young to fight, but old enough to sprinkle water or shoo away birds. They took pride in watching a wilted leaf stand tall again. It reminded them that not everything was dying. Some castles took it a step further. They kept bees. Yep, inside the walls, tucked in wooden boxes or clay pots. Because honey wasn't just a treat, it was a preservative, a wound healer, and a sweet distraction from the grim monotony of siege food. Imagine the delight of adding a spoonful of honey to your turnip stew. A tiny miracle, a medieval Michelin star. And if the siege lasted into spring, lucky you, dandelions, wild garlic, nettles, and even mushrooms might join the lineup. Every weed was inspected with suspicion. Is it edible? Will it kill me? Is it both? That became the new risk analysis model. One monk even wrote about taming pigeons in the garden, not for companionship, but for eggs and occasional stew. A siege garden wasn't just a plant patch. It was an entire tiny ecosystem of hope. But as time went on and even the cabbage stalks stood bare, many castle dwellers turned to the final fallback, foraging the interior. They searched walls for edible moss, scraped lichen off stones, and tried to boil leather belts into soup. It said that parchment pages were soaked and chewed texts, lost to stomachs rather than time. And yet somehow, many survived. Because resilience isn't always grand. Sometimes it's hidden in a fist-sized patch of onion sprouts. Sometimes it's a child guarding 2 carrots like royal treasure. Sometimes it's just waiting. One more day. So next time you complain about your fridge being empty, remember nobody's firing flaming arrows at your parsley. Let's step into the stone bowels of the castle, the cold, damp, unglamorous realm where true medieval survival happened, the storerooms and cellars. Not the grand feasting halls filled with roasted boar and jolly lute music. No, those were for peace times. We're talking about the dim chambers beneath your feet, where the smell of pickled cabbage was strong enough to knock out a grown knight. Because when a siege dragged on for weeks or even months, these rooms became the lifeline of the entire population. And let's be clear, they weren't organized like a modern pantry. There were no neat labels or airtight containers. Picture instead wooden barrels, oozing at the seams, sacks of grain tied shut with frayed rope, and rats darting between floor cracks like they paid rent. And speaking of rats, some of them weren't always considered pests. Let's just say desperate times created desperate recipes. But first, let's look at what the castle planners actually intended to store. The top priority was grain, wheat, barley, rye. Grains could last through winter and beyond if kept dry and free from mold. Castles often had granaries on higher floors to prevent flooding lined with stone or clay, to discourage chewing from both vermin and humans with questionable self-control. Then came preserved meats, salted pork, smoked fish, dried sausage. These were stashed in cooler rooms or suspended from beams to avoid spoilage and unfortunate incidents involving thieving hands. Cheese was another staple, hard, pungent wheels, stacked like edible cannonballs. The older and drier, the better, which meant the more it smelled like your great-uncle's boots, the more valuable it was during the siege. Next up, legumes. Dried peas, beans, and lentils. Not exciting, but full of protein and surprisingly durable. Boil them in water, add salt if you had any left, and boom, you've got mush. And not to be forgotten, the barrels of ale and vinegar. Ale wasn't just for getting slightly tipsy during a long, gloomy siege. It was also safer to drink than most water sources, and even children drank weak ale daily. Vinegar was used to preserve what little freshness remained and to mask the taste of things you probably didn't want to know the origin of. But here's where things get complicated. You couldn't just stockpile food like you were prepping for a Netflix apocalypse. Everything had to be rotated, monitored, and most critically guarded. Yes, guards were assigned to the food stores, and not just from outside threats. There were always whispers. A night watchman missing a link of sausage, a cook pocketing dried cherries for his niece, a noblewoman asking for just a few extra almonds every night. Food theft was as dangerous as a breach in the wall, because one missing barrel could mean one less week of survival. So castle officials created rationing systems. Each person, soldier, cook, servant received a strict daily portion. A few ounces of bread, a scoop of peas, maybe a sliver of dried meat. Those caught cheating the system were sometimes locked in the larder overnight, a punishment equal parts terrifying and ironic. And then there was the issue of morale. Imagine chewing the same bread jerky pea combo for 42 days straight. Your taste buds die. Your imagination dies. Your will to live quietly packs a bag and walks away. To keep spirits up, some castles appointed a siege cook, a sort of medieval morale officer whose job was to combine boring rations into something vaguely creative. Pea mash with dried garlic and a drizzle of sour ale, reheated oat cakes with vinegar syrup. Congratulations, you've just discovered the original prison fine dining. Meanwhile, the wealthiest castle dwellers, lords and ladies, still managed to sneak in slightly better meals. They might barter for honeycombs or send servants to trade trinkets for dried herbs. But even their feasts became smaller and sadder as the siege wore on. Roast pheasant turned into roast rat, eventually becoming no roast at all. And now a moment to ask, are you still with me? Still awake? If you've fallen asleep somewhere between salted pork and rat stew, honestly, I don't blame you. But if you're still here, eyes blinking, ears wide open, then let me reward you with one last morsel, the tale of the cursed onion. In one documented siege, a cook hoarded a single onion in a secret drawer. He told no one. For weeks, he would sneak down each night, slice a paper-thin ring, and suck on it in the shadows. Until one day, the onion disappeared. The cook accused everyone, screamed, cried. He was dragged before the lord of the castle. Turns out the onion had rolled behind a barrel and begun sprouting. It was replanted in the courtyard garden and grew into 3 new onions, which were immediately divided and eaten. A siege miracle, or a culinary tragedy. Depends on your point of view. And so deep in those musty storerooms, surrounded by rats' regrets and fermented goat's milk, the medieval world quietly endured. Because survival wasn't always heroic. Sometimes it was just a slice of moldy cheese and a spoonful of pea mash shared in silence. And now, as the siege stretches into its final gasps, we arrive at a question both troubling and inevitable. What happened when the food actually ran out? Because let's face it, no matter how clever your storeroom was, or how tightly you rationed your dried beans, there was always a breaking point. The siege could go on longer than your oats, longer than your salted fish, longer than your patience. And that's when things got creative. Let's begin gently. First, they ate the animals. Not the prized war horses. At first, those were precious symbols of power and survival. Instead, they started with the chickens, the pigeons, the goats, anything small and domestic that could be quietly turned into soup. But then came the cats, then the dogs, and eventually, yes, even the horses. Accounts from castle sieges across Europe describe noblemen weeping as their family's favorite mare was led to the butcher block. And once the animals were gone, there were still a few desperate options left. Grass, bark, leather. Yes, people boiled the leather from shoes and belts. They scraped moss from the walls. Some even roasted straw. Anything that could vaguely resemble food was trialed, tested, and tragically tasted. In one particularly bleak account from the siege of Rochester in 1215, it was said that the men dined on parchment, scraping ink from legal scrolls, soaking the vellum in water, and chewing it slowly like jerky. A law book has never tasted so bitter. And while all this was happening inside the castle, the enemy outside was watching. They knew the game. They counted the days. They sniffed the wind. Sometimes they even sent in spies disguised as beggars, hoping to overhear who had eaten what and how long ago. If you caught a whisper that the cook was out of flour or that the guards were arguing over scraps, that meant the siege was almost over. Sometimes, though, survival depended not on food or water, but on deception. There's a story from a castle in northern France. The garrison had almost nothing left, so the commander took their last bag of oats, fed it to the last remaining mule, and tied it to the castle wall where the enemy could see it. Then they loudly shouted, "We're tired of eating our fattened mules." Will this siege ever end? The attackers, believing the castle was still swimming in resources, packed up and left 2 days later, bluffing the medieval diet plan. Still, not all castles were so lucky. Some truly endured the full horror of starvation, and that's where the darkest rumors lie. We won't dwell long, but yes, there were whispered stories of cannibalism, of grave robbing, of madness born from hunger. But most often, most nobly, people just endured. They shrunk. They faded. They clung to hope or prayer or the final crust of bread hidden in a boot. And when finally the siege lifted, either through a truce, a rescue, or the enemy getting bored, the survivors didn't celebrate. They crawled into the light. Some too weak to stand. Many blinking at the sky, unsure if they'd made it to salvation, or simply some quieter form of purgatory. And yet survive they did. Because medieval castles were not just stone and mortar. They were made of stubbornness, of cleverness, of the quiet, steady rhythm of human grit. So the next time you microwave dinner and sigh because your noodles are a little soggy, remember the woman in the tower eating boiled shoe leather. And if that doesn't help, consider this: she didn't even have salt.